Number 10. The English sweat houses and fever beliefs. Some outbreaks in history are terrifying because we can identify the disease and follow its spread with relative confidence. Others are terrifying because what survives is not just sickness, but a whole atmosphere of fear built around the places, habits, and beliefs people thought might be making them ill. The English sweat houses and fever beliefs belong to that second category. In early modern and late medieval Europe, people did not always separate heat, air, bodily imbalance, dampness, and contagion the way modern medicine does. They lived in a world where enclosed warmth could be healing in one context and dangerous in another, where bad vapors, overheated blood, corrupted humors, and improper sweating could all become part of how illness was understood. That is what makes this case so unsettling. It is not about one single plague with a neat beginning and end. It is about the dark medical imagination surrounding fever, heat, and the body's instability. Sweat houses, hot rooms, and intense sweating practices could be linked in some minds to purification or recovery, but just as easily to weakness, collapse, or dangerous exposure when the body was thought to be vulnerable. If someone emerged from heat into cold air and fell sick, that could reinforce existing fears. If fever swept through a town, people might interpret warm interiors, foul air, or bodily overheating not simply as conditions, but as causes. In such a world, the built environment itself began to feel suspicious. What deepens the fear here is the way fever beliefs turn ordinary life into threat. A mysterious disease is frightening enough when it comes from outside. It becomes worse when people begin to suspect their own rooms, baths, walls, air, clothing, or daily habits. Heat can soothe, but it can also trap breath, intensify smell, and make illness feel more immediate. Medieval and early modern medicine was highly sensitive to balance, to the idea that the body could be tipped into danger by excess warmth, corrupted moisture, or improperly managed sweat. That meant fever was never just a symptom. It could feel like evidence that the body's whole internal order was breaking down. This also reveals something important about historical outbreaks. Panic grows most easily when explanations are half-formed. People knew illness had patterns. They noticed that certain spaces felt unhealthy, that certain conditions seemed to precede collapse, that sweat and weakness often traveled together. But without modern germ theory, those observations could harden into broader fears about vapors, overheated chambers, or the wrong kind of bodily release. The result was a medical culture in which houses, baths, fever rooms, and heat itself could become morally and physically charged. The home was no longer automatically safe. It could become a place where sickness gathered. And that is why the English sweat houses and fever beliefs take the number 10 spot. They remind us that historical fear did not always attach itself to one neatly named disease. Sometimes it attached itself to a whole web of bodily practices, heated rooms, and uncertain medical logic, until people could no longer tell whether they were confronting illness itself or the conditions they believed had invited it in. That ambiguity is part of what makes such cases so haunting. When people do not understand what is killing them, even warmth can start to feel cursed. Number 9. The Strasbourg Mass Hysteria. Some outbreaks spread through blood, lungs, or water. Others spread through the mind, through fear, imitation, pressure, and the mysterious way human beings can begin to reflect one another's distress until a whole community seems to tip into unreality. The Strasbourg Mass Hysteria belongs to that second category. Associated with episodes of compulsive dancing and extreme collective disturbance in the region, it stands as one of the strangest forms of outbreak in European history. Bodies moved uncontrollably, crowds watched, explanations failed, and what might have begun with a few afflicted individuals expanded into something that looked, to the people living through it, almost like a curse taking hold in public. That is what makes it so disturbing. A plague of visible sores or fever can at least be recognized as disease. But when people begin dancing, convulsing, or acting in ways that seem both voluntary and involuntary at once, the boundaries of explanation start to collapse. Were they sick, possessed, punished, contaminated by terror? Medieval and early modern societies did not treat those possibilities as mutually exclusive. In times of stress, spiritual anxiety, hunger, and communal pressure, the body could become a stage on which unseen crisis appeared. The outbreak was not less frightening because it was strange. It was more frightening because no one knew what exactly was being transmitted. The Strasbourg case reveals something essential about the nature of unexplained outbreaks. Not all epidemics kill in the same way, but many shatter meaning in the same way. Once enough people believe that something is moving through a crowd, whether demon, curse, divine punishment, or mysterious affliction, the social environment itself changes. Observation becomes participation, fear becomes imitation. The individual body stops feeling entirely private. It becomes vulnerable to the emotional weather of the whole community. That is part of why mass hysteria has always been so terrifying. It suggests that what spreads is not only pathogen, but possibility. There is also something deeply medieval about the way such episodes were interpreted. Strasbourg was not a world buffered by clinical psychology or neurological certainty. It was a world where saints, sin, misfortune, spirits, and bodily disturbance still lived close together in people's minds. If an outbreak of uncontrollable behavior erupted, it was natural to seek meaning beyond flesh alone. That meant the crisis could quickly become moralized or ritualized. Religious processions, public responses, and attempts at control might all reinforce the idea that the event belonged to a larger cosmic order. The body in motion became evidence of invisible judgment. And that is why the Strasbourg Mass Hysteria takes the number 9 spot. It was not simply a strange social event. It was an outbreak of meaninglessness in a world desperate for meaning, a moment when the body itself seemed to stop obeying ordinary rules, and the crowd began to amplify what it could not explain. The most haunting epidemics are not always the ones with the highest death toll. Sometimes they are the ones that make people wonder whether reality itself has become unstable. Strasbourg did exactly that. Number 8. The sleeping sickness, panic. In colonial Africa, some outbreaks become terrifying because of what they do to the body. Others become terrifying because of what fear, empire, and incomplete knowledge do to the meaning of the disease. The sleeping sickness panic in colonial Africa belongs to that second category. Human African trypanosomiasis was a real and devastating disease, but the historical terror surrounding it grew far beyond symptoms alone. In regions already destabilized by colonial intrusion, forced movement, administrative violence, and fragile medical understanding, the disease came to represent something larger, a hidden force moving through villages, riverlands, labor systems, and entire colonial frontiers, turning sleep itself into an omen of slow death. That is what made it so disturbing. Sleep is supposed to restore the body, but in the imagination shaped by this disease, sleep became suspicious. Drowsiness, weakness, wasting, confusion, and decline created an atmosphere in which the most ordinary human act began to look like surrender to something invisible and unstoppable. For people living through the outbreaks and the panic surrounding them, this was not only a medical event. It was a crisis of interpretation. Was the land cursed? Were certain waters dangerous? Were spirits involved? Was this the price of forced disruption, new routes, new authorities, and the rearrangement of life under colonial rule? The uncertainty made the disease feel larger than biology. The colonial setting deepens the darkness even further. Sleeping sickness unfolded in a world where European authorities often claimed scientific control while still misunderstanding local realities, and where African communities were forced to navigate both the disease itself and the administrative responses imposed around it. Camps, relocations, forced surveillance, restricted movement, and intrusive medical policies could turn the response to the outbreak into a second source of suffering. That matters because historical terror rarely comes from illness alone. It comes from the structure built around illness, the rumors it generates, the power it activates, and the sense that once disease appears, ordinary control over life is gone. This is one of the reasons the panic around sleeping sickness became so potent. The symptoms were slow enough to be eerie, visible enough to unsettle communities, and poorly understood enough to invite dread. A person did not simply collapse in a dramatic moment. They drifted. They weakened. They seemed to slip out of the world gradually. Few kinds of illness are more psychologically disturbing than those that feel like a person is being quietly withdrawn from life before death fully arrives. In a colonial landscape already haunted by coercion, exploitation, and rupture, that slow withdrawal could easily become surrounded by rumors, fatalism, and the sense that something larger than disease was moving through the population. And that is why the sleeping sickness panic in colonial Africa takes the number 8 spot. It was not just an outbreak. It was an outbreak filtered through empire, fear, forced control, and the terrifying image of a disease that made sleep itself feel hostile. History remembers it not only because people were sick, but because entire systems of power and panic closed around the sickness until it became one of the most haunting examples of how disease and domination can magnify one another. In that world, to grow tired was no longer ordinary. It was to risk being marked by something no one felt they fully understood. Number 7. The curse of the Pharaoh's tomb. Some outbreaks are terrifying because they spread through populations. Others are terrifying because they seem to gather around a place, a discovery, and a series of deaths just strange enough to make the modern world briefly sound medieval again. The curse of the Pharaoh's tomb belongs to that second category. Most famously attached to the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in the early 20th century, it is not a plague in the same way as the other entries on this list. It is something more psychologically seductive. A chain of illness, death, rumor, and public fascination that convinced many people they might be witnessing a punishment awakened from the ancient dead. That is what gives the case its enduring power. Tombs are already perfect vessels for fear. They are sealed, sacred, ancient, and tied to the idea that the dead were meant to remain undisturbed. Once an excavation opens such a place, every subsequent misfortune becomes charged with possibility. A fever is no longer merely fever. An infection is no longer merely infection. A sudden death is no longer random. It becomes evidence, or at least the beginning of evidence, that something has followed the living out of the tomb. That is exactly how curse narratives survive. They feed on timing, symbolism, and the human inability to leave coincidence emotionally unshaped. What makes the Pharaoh's tomb curse especially fascinating is that it emerged in an age that considered itself modern, scientific, and skeptical. That should have made the legend weaker, but in some ways it made it stronger. The more the public imagined archaeology as a rational conquest of the past, the more thrilling it became to think that the past might answer back. Newspapers amplified the atmosphere. Exoticism, colonial excavation, ancient kingship, and dramatic deaths created the perfect mixture for mass belief. Egypt was not presented as merely old. It was presented as old in a way that still seemed dangerous, as if ancient ritual and buried sovereignty had retained some lingering force modernity could not fully neutralize. There is also a deeper truth beneath the myth. Even if no supernatural curse was at work, tomb environments, bacteria, molds, stress, travel, and chance all existed within the same story. That ambiguity is crucial. The legend endured precisely because real death and magical explanation overlapped just enough to make certainty emotionally impossible. A fully invented curse is easy to dismiss. A curse attached to real funerary chambers and real subsequent deaths becomes harder to shake, because the mind keeps asking, where the ancient warning and natural danger might be cooperating in ways no one expected. And that is why the curse of the Pharaoh's tomb takes the number 7 spot. It shows that people do not need a continent-wide epidemic to feel outbreak-level fear. Sometimes all they need is a sealed chamber, a dead king, a handful of badly timed deaths, and the suspicion that the old world has not surrendered its power as completely as the modern world assumed. The curse remains haunting because it turns archaeology into contagion of a different kind, not a disease that moves through bodies alone, but a story that infects interpretation itself. Number 6. The Antonine Plague. Some outbreaks are terrifying because they emerge in the shadows of poorly documented ages. Others are terrifying because they strike at the heart of a civilization that believes itself powerful, ordered, and protected. The Antonine Plague belongs to that second category. Spreading through the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, likely during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, it was one of the first great imperial-scale disease catastrophes to leave a deep scar on the Roman world. Soldiers, cities, trade routes, and distant provinces all became channels through which sickness moved, and what made the plague so frightening was not only the death it caused, but the way it exposed how fragile even the mightiest empire could be. That is what gives the Antonine Plague such a haunting place in history. Rome was supposed to represent order, law, military reach, and civilizational confidence. Yet disease moved through that structure with a kind of indifferent force. Armies carried it, crowded cities amplified it. Imperial connectivity, one of Rome's greatest strengths, became a weakness. This is one of the darkest truths about historical outbreaks. The more successful a civilization becomes at linking its territory together, the more efficiently disease can travel through the very arteries of its success. In that sense, the plague did not merely kill Romans, it turned Roman scale against itself. The fear surrounding it was sharpened by uncertainty. Ancient medicine could observe symptoms, patterns, and the broad difference between healthier and deadlier conditions, but it could not provide the kind of explanatory certainty modern people expect. That meant illness did not stay neatly inside the category of biology. It could be interpreted as divine anger, environmental corruption, military contamination from foreign lands, or the punishment that follows moral decline. A plague striking during war and political strain always invites larger meanings. People do not see only sick bodies. They begin to see omens. The empire is no longer merely infected. It begins to look judged. The Antonine Plague also matters because of how it may have contributed to broader Roman weakening. Historians can debate exact scale and consequence, but in cultural memory, the event feels larger than mortality statistics alone. It marks one of those moments when an empire first seems to understand that victory over enemies does not guarantee safety from forces it cannot fight on a battlefield. That realization is psychologically devastating. An enemy army can be confronted with strategy. A plague moving invisibly through barracks, streets, homes, and imperial roads attacks something deeper. It attacks confidence itself. And that is why the Antonine Plague takes the number 6 spot. It was not just a disease outbreak. It was one of the earliest great demonstrations that imperial order could be penetrated by something no legion could stab and no emperor could command into retreat. The plague lingers in memory because it turned Rome's greatness into a stage for helplessness. Civilization did not collapse in a single moment, but the illusion of invulnerability suffered a wound that history never fully forgot. Number 5. The sweating sickness. Some outbreaks are terrifying because they unfold slowly, allowing fear to accumulate over weeks and months. Others are terrifying because they seem to strike almost out of nowhere, move with horrifying speed, and leave people wondering whether they have hours rather than days left to live. The sweating sickness belongs to that second category. Appearing in England in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, it became one of the most unnerving diseases in European memory, precisely because of how sudden and poorly understood it seemed. A person could appear well, fall ill rapidly, begin sweating intensely, weaken with alarming speed, and be dead within a day. Few forms of disease inspire panic more effectively than the ones that allow almost no time to prepare. That is what made the sweating sickness feel so uncanny. It did not simply resemble the great plague traditions people already feared. It had its own rhythm, and that rhythm was wrong. The body became clammy, unstable, and dangerous to itself. Heat and cold, sweat and dread, exhaustion and speed all came together in a way that made the illness feel almost designed to produce terror. In a pre-modern medical world where fever was already deeply feared and bodily imbalance could be interpreted through humours, air, and hidden corruption, such a rapid disease was not just alarming, it was disorienting. People did not know whether to fear the air, the room, the season, the body, or fate itself. Its social atmosphere was equally disturbing. Because the illness struck quickly and unpredictably, it seemed to move through familiar life with a kind of intimate menace. This was not only a disease of distant battlefields or remote villages. It could appear in households, courts, towns, and circles of status. Its reputation for hitting the strong as well as the weak deepened the fear. Many diseases could be imagined as preying most easily on the poor, the malnourished, or the already vulnerable. But an illness that seemed able to seize vigorous people and destroy them swiftly felt more arbitrary and therefore more terrifying. Once disease begins to look arbitrary, panic grows faster. The mystery of the sweating sickness is one of the reasons it remains so gripping now. Even later historians and medical thinkers have struggled to identify it with certainty, and that uncertainty preserves some of the original dread. It is one thing to say a past society misread a disease we now understand. It is another to confront an outbreak that still resists perfect explanation. That lingering ambiguity helps modern imagination meet historical fear halfway. The illness did not only terrify the people who lived through it, it still carries a residue of strangeness because we cannot entirely pin it down. And that is why the sweating sickness takes the number 5 spot. It represents one of the purest forms of outbreak terror, sudden onset, rapid death, incomplete explanation, and the feeling that ordinary health could vanish within a single day. History remembers many epidemics because they were vast. The sweating sickness is remembered because it felt intimate, swift, and unpredictably lethal. It did not just spread disease, it spread the horrifying idea that a healthy body might already be only hours away from collapse. Number 4. The Cocoliztli Epidemics. Some outbreaks are terrifying because they kill enormous numbers of people. Others are terrifying because they strike populations already under conquest, upheaval, and collapse, until disease begins to feel inseparable from the destruction of an entire world. The Cocoliztli epidemics belong to that second category. Sweeping through New Spain in the 16th century, these catastrophic outbreaks killed indigenous populations on a devastating scale and entered history wrapped in uncertainty, fear, and the sense that something almost apocalyptic had been unleashed. Even now, the exact nature of Cocoliztli remains debated, which only deepens the darkness surrounding it. To the people living through it, the illness was not just lethal, it was overwhelming. That is what makes Cocoliztli so haunting. This was not a society encountering disease under stable conditions. It was a society already shattered by conquest, forced labor, displacement, ecological disruption, and the violent remaking of life under colonial rule. When mass death arrives in such a context, it does not feel like a medical event alone. It feels like judgment, curse, annihilation, or the unraveling of creation itself. The body fails, but so does meaning. Entire communities watching relatives die in astonishing numbers could hardly be expected to separate disease from the larger catastrophe engulfing them. In such circumstances, illness becomes historical trauma concentrated into flesh. The fear surrounding Cocoliztli was sharpened by symptoms that seemed severe, strange, and uncontrollable. Accounts describe a devastating sickness that moved quickly and left people searching desperately for explanation. Without modern diagnostic certainty, the disease could only become more terrifying. Was it something in the land, something brought by the conquerors, something awakened by disruption, drought, hunger, or divine anger? The inability to answer those questions matters just as much as the mortality itself. An outbreak becomes most psychologically destructive when no one can say with confidence what is killing people or why it seems to have chosen them so completely. There is also a deeper reason Cocoliztli remains one of history's darkest epidemic mysteries. It exposes how disease and empire can combine into something worse than either one alone. Colonial systems did not simply observe the dying. They helped create the conditions in which populations became more vulnerable, less stable, and more exposed to mass mortality. That does not mean every detail of the disease can be reduced to politics, but it does mean the terror surrounding it cannot be separated from conquest. For those living through it, the outbreak was part of a larger truth. The old order had been broken, and now death was moving through the ruins. And that is why the Cocoliztli Epidemics take the number 4 spot. They were not just outbreaks. They were one of the most chilling examples of disease arriving inside a conquered world and becoming almost indistinguishable from civilizational collapse. History remembers them because the death toll was immense, but it fears them because the cause remains shadowed and the setting makes the entire event feel cursed by circumstance. Cocoliztli is what happens when disease no longer seems like misfortune alone, but like the final language of conquest. Number 3. The Plague of Justinian. Some outbreaks terrify because they are strange. Others terrify because they are so vast that they seem to darken whole centuries. The Plague of Justinian belongs to that second category. Beginning in the 6th century and spreading through the Byzantine Empire and far beyond, it became one of the earliest great pandemic shocks of the post-classical world. Cities, ports, trade networks, and imperial systems all carried it outward. And what makes it so haunting is that it struck at a civilization that still imagined itself capable of restoring Roman greatness. Instead, disease entered that imperial ambition like a shadow, and reminded the world that even the most organized state could be humbled by invisible death. That is what gives the Plague of Justinian such a grim power in history. Constantinople was not a forgotten town on the edge of nowhere. It was one of the great cities of the world, a center of empire, trade, law, and sacred authority. When plague reached such a place, it did not just kill individuals. It infected confidence in the entire structure of civilization. Bodies piled up, administrative systems strained, movement, commerce, and daily life were disrupted. And because the empire was so interconnected, the very networks that gave it strength helped carry the disease farther. The pandemic revealed a truth that history would repeat many times. Scale multiplies vulnerability. The people living through it did not possess modern microbiology, but they understood enough to know that something immense and unnatural seemed to be happening. Death was everywhere, and when death becomes pervasive enough, explanation begins to shift from medical observation toward cosmic meaning. Divine punishment, corrupted air, fate, and moral crisis all become easier to believe. This is especially true in religious civilizations, where catastrophe is rarely interpreted as random for very long. The plague therefore became not only a disease event, but a crisis of theology and order. It was not just asking who would die. It was asking what kind of world people were living in if so many could die like this. What makes the Plague of Justinian especially chilling is the way it seems to stand at the edge of transformation. Historians continue to debate its precise long-term effects, but in cultural memory it feels like one of those events that help turn a world darker. Ambitions narrow, confidence weakens, restoration becomes harder to imagine. A civilization that hoped to project permanence finds itself surrounded by fragility instead. That emotional shift matters. Plagues do not only reduce populations, they alter what societies believe is possible. The Plague of Justinian feels frightening partly because it appears at the exact point where imperial dream meets biological reality and loses, and that is why the Plague of Justinian takes the number 3 spot. It was not merely a terrible outbreak, it was one of history's earliest demonstrations that pandemic disease could invade the center of a great empire and make even monumental power look brittle. The plague remains haunting because it did not just spread death. It spread the realization that the machinery of civilization could keep running only until something invisible entered it and taught everyone how breakable it really was. Number 2. The Dancing Plague of 1518. Some outbreaks are terrifying because they destroy the body through fever, bleeding, or visible decay. Others are terrifying because they seem to seize the body without leaving behind any stable explanation at all. The Dancing Plague of 1518 belongs to that second category. In Strasbourg, men and women reportedly began dancing in the streets in ways that looked compulsive, prolonged, and deeply unnatural to those watching. What makes the event so haunting is not only that it happened, but that it unfolded in public. This was not a private sickness hidden behind walls. It was a visible breakdown of bodily control, performed before an entire community that could do little but watch, interpret, and fear. That is what gave the Dancing Plague its extraordinary psychological power. A fever can be frightening, but at least it looks like illness. Uncontrolled dancing sits in a darker place. It appears halfway between possession, madness, punishment, and some bodily mechanism gone catastrophically wrong. People saw movement where there should have been rest, exhaustion where there should have been collapse, and repetition where there should have been recovery. In a world without modern psychology, neurology, or clear medical frameworks for mass psychogenic illness, the event could not remain merely strange. It had to become meaningful. And once people begin searching for meaning inside something so visible and so inexplicable, panic grows quickly. The context matters enormously. Strasbourg was a world of religious pressure, social strain, hunger, anxiety, and a population already accustomed to interpreting unusual suffering through spiritual and moral categories. If people danced beyond endurance, what could that mean? Divine judgment, saintly curse, demonic influence, corrupted blood, and communal affliction were all more available explanations than the kinds of diagnoses a later age might prefer. That is what makes the Dancing Plague so revealing. It shows how outbreaks become terrifying, not only because of what the body does, but because of the meanings the surrounding culture is forced to project onto it when knowledge fails. There is also something uniquely disturbing about the contagiousness of behavior. With an ordinary plague, people fear being near the sick because of what might pass into the body. With a dancing outbreak, fear becomes more intimate and unsettling. What if what spreads is not substance alone, but suggestion, emotion, terror, expectation, or the collapse of psychological boundaries? That possibility makes the event feel almost supernatural even when one tries to explain it naturally. The body stops looking fully private. It begins to look vulnerable to the crowd itself. That is why such cases linger so powerfully in memory. They suggest that under pressure, human beings can begin transmitting distress in ways that no one present fully understands. And that is why the Dancing Plague of 1518 takes the number 2 spot. It was not simply bizarre. It was one of the clearest examples in history of an outbreak that turned the human body into a public mystery. It terrified people because it looked like disease, judgment, and possession all at once, while fitting neatly into none of them. Even now it remains haunting because the usual comforts of explanation still feel incomplete. The plague dances at the edge of understanding, and that is exactly why it refuses to die in historical memory. Number 1. The Black Death. Some outbreaks are remembered because they were strange. Others are remembered because they became the standard by which historical terror itself is measured. The Black Death belongs to that highest category. Sweeping across Europe in the 14th century, and killing on a scale so immense that entire communities seem to stagger out of one world and into another. It remains the most iconic plague in Western historical memory for a reason. The Black Death did not merely spread illness. It altered society, religion, labor, imagination, and the very emotional texture of life. Few events have made mortality feel so total, so intimate, and so impossible to escape. That is what gives the Black Death its unmatched force. This was not a localized crisis or a disease affecting one class alone. It crossed boundaries relentlessly. Towns, villages, monasteries, trade routes, households, and burial grounds all became part of the same expanding geography of death. The ordinary structures that make life feel dependable, family, work, ritual, public order, familiar streets, could no longer reliably protect anyone. When enough people die quickly enough, society begins to lose not only labor and population, but meaning. The routines that once held the world together remain visible, but they feel hollowed out. The Black Death produced exactly that kind of historical void. Its terror was magnified by the fact that people could not explain it with anything like certainty. Theories proliferated: divine punishment, corrupted air, planetary conjunctions, poisoned wells, moral decay, foreign contamination, apocalyptic warning. Some explanations were sincere, some desperate, some murderous in their consequences. But all of them emerged from the same unbearable reality. Death was moving faster than understanding. That is one of the reasons the Black Death became more than an epidemic. It became a crisis of truth. If no one could say what the plague truly was, then every fear could potentially attach itself to it. Medicine, theology, rumor, and violence all crowded in to fill the vacuum. What makes the Black Death especially deserving of the #1 spot is the way it fused biological catastrophe with civilizational memory. Later generations did not remember it only as a disease event. They remembered it as a shadow over an entire age. Art darkened. Religious feeling intensified and fractured. Social relations shifted. The image of carts, pits, bells, deserted houses, and bodies marked by death entered collective imagination permanently. Even where later retellings exaggerated specific scenes, the emotional truth needed no help. The plague had shown Europe what it meant for the familiar world to become unrecognizable while still physically standing around you. And that is why the Black Death takes the #1 spot. It was not just one outbreak among many. It became the archetype of plague itself, the historical nightmare in which death ceases to feel like misfortune and starts to feel like atmosphere. It remains the darkest entry on this list because it combined everything that makes an outbreak unforgettable: scale, mystery, panic, religious fear, social collapse, rumor, and the unbearable visibility of mass mortality. When people imagine the Age of Plague, it is usually the Black Death they are seeing, because no other outbreak so completely taught civilization what helplessness looked like.